But what is this disquieting new insight? Our three authors agree in recognizing that some sort of behavior, once regarded as virtuous, and for which they partly continue to have and partly only pretend to have a nostalgic sympathy, leads to negative consequences, while the opposite behavior, which partly the tradition and partly they themselves condemn as vicious, can be beneficial to society at large. This is linked to the modern discovery that human behavior may well have unintended consequences. Consequences that not only the social theorist, but also the ethicist is well advised to study. Since intentionality is the essence of spirit, those human forces that determine our behavior in a blind, irreflexive way become particularly important for the study of man, and thus the 17th and 18th centuries abound in theories of passions, which many authors teach can only be checked by countervailing passions, not by a practical reason deemed increasingly powerless. Albert Hirschman, famous German-American economist, has masterfully analyzed the development of these theories and the transformation of the concept of passion into the concept of interest. By subjecting the passions to some long-term end, interest made human behavior calculable and predictable, and thus less dangerous. If I return to this history, I do it with a specific interest in the nature of their ethical argument. Their discoveries were intellectually exciting, but also probably emotionally painful to all three authors. Although both Machiavelli and Mandeville, particularly the latter, hide their unease behind open cynicism. But it would be wrong to overlook their moral seriousness. They do not invite humans to engage in behavior that most people still regard as repulsive simply because this will increase their individual profit. No, their argument transcends personal interest and is oriented towards the common good. This makes their stance an ethical one, despite the sarcasm they occasionally display, and distinguishes them from ancient immoralists such as Thrasymachos in Plato's Politeia or Callicles in the Gorgias, whose position cannot and does not seek to be universalized. Let us look at the basic moral idea in the three most popular books of our authors, the three terrible mass. Machiavelli's exhaustive political philosophy is laid out in the Discorsi sopra la prima decca di Tito Livio, but his most widely read book is the short treatise Il Principe, the Prince. I cannot discuss here how Machiavelli's defense of principalities is compatible with the staunch republicanism which he lays out in his main work, and which makes him one of the most democratic authors in the history of political thought between the Romans and the 18th century. Suffice it to remark that Machiavelli seems to believe that only in certain historical epochs, namely when nations have been corrupted to their cores, do princes become inevitable and are thus to be accepted as the lesser evil. But I have to ignore this here as I do his classification of the various types of principalities. What is of interest in his deliberate inversion of the tradition of the mirrors of princes, particularly in chapters 15 through 18 of Il Principe. This genre of a mirror of prince, already to be found in classical antiquity in authors such as Xenophon and Seneca, enjoyed great popularity in the Middle Ages. Monks often wrote such mirrors, such as Maragdus de Saint-Michiel's Via Regia of 1813, or Aquinas' De Regimine Principum in 1516. And in 1516, shortly after Machiavelli, Erasmus wrote his Institutio Principis Christiani, Education of a Christian Prince, for Charles, King of Spain and later Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire of German nation. While these mirrors taught the princes Christian virtues, the disturbing originality of Machiavelli's book consists in the message that the good prince, at least, should not have all of these virtues. On the contrary, he should display some character traits that the Christian tradition has sharply condemned, and he should do so not only in order to preserve himself, but also in order to foster the interest of his polity. For only strong states can secure the thriving of a people by warding off the danger that civil unrest and attacks from other countries represent. In order to achieve this end, the prince is permitted, even morally obliged, to develop habits that the tradition declared vicious. It is necessary for a prince who wants to maintain his position to learn to be able to be not good, Machiavelli writes. Good here can hardly mean behaving according to duty, for the necessity about which Machiavelli writes is not a hypothetical one. He does not say that if you want to maintain power, you will have to behave in a way that is immoral, suggesting that the latter is inadmissible and that therefore one should give up the quest for power. The whole thrust of the book and the reflections anterior to this passage, which criticize the mere imagination of polities that have nothing to do with the bleak reality of human nature, point in the opposite direction. Machiavelli thinks that an intelligent holder of power is entitled, even morally obliged, to dispense with goodness, the necessity of which he speaks has a deontic flavor. And this entails, under the pain of self-contradiction, that goodness does not mean right behavior, but rather a behavior only so-called because it manifests itself in kindness and benevolence, which, however, are not always morally recommendable. This becomes clear at the end of a chapter where Machiavelli states that it would be a wonderful thing if in a prince all the virtues commonly so called could be united. But since this is impossible, the prince should always avoid the reputation of having those vices that would endanger his position. He should also avoid the other vices if possible. When impossible, that is, when incompatible with the preservation of power, he should accept them. This probably shows that Machiavelli recognizes that those vices have a negative intrinsic value. However, their positive consequences for the preservation of power outweigh that value. And thus he ends the chapter with these words. One will find something that will look like virtue, but if followed, will lead to his ruin. And something else that will look like vice, but if followed, will lead to his security and prosperity. In your tradition, of course, the legalists come to mind, and Fay, but as I said, the Machiavellian revolution of the relation of morals and politics is the most natural one. The analogous revolution in economics and demography comes later and is much more complex. Traditional virtues are thus demoted to the realm of merely apparent values if they are detrimental to self-preservation. This seems to be a merely egoistic criterion for defining true virtue. But Machiavelli soon shows that what he has in mind is the interest of the people. Among the traditional virtues he demotes are liberality, clemency, and faithfulness, of which the second enjoys a particular prestige in Christianity. His his arguments against the prince, who is a spendthrift and thus will soon be obliged to raise money from his subjects, are quite easy to follow, and more a challenge of courtly values, particularly of what Ephesus from Aristotle onward praised under the title of megaloprepeia munificence, than of legitimate moral ideas of the emerging bourgeois world, which Machiavelli surreptitiously proposes to Lorenzo de' Medici, the prince to whom he dedicates his book. More disturbing is his defense of crudeltà, even if it is misleading to translate the term as cruelty. For today, the English and the Italian terms seem to imply a pleasure in inflicting pain on other people, while Machiavelli has in mind only toughness against those who challenge the prince's power. But the decisive argument for his conclusion is that Cesare Borgia, through his toughness, was able to pacify the Romagna, while Florence, desiring to avoid the reputation of being tough, refused to deal forcefully with the civil unrest in Pistoia in 1501, which led to much more bloodshed. What Machiavelli rejects is, in any case, the inconsistency of praising, on the one hand, the military discipline that Hannibal upheld, while on the other hand, condemning the severity without which such discipline would quickly evaporate. Machiavelli's attack against the virtues of the traditional mirrors of princes does not lack moral substance. He measures the moral value of a policy by its utility for the prince's own polity, transcending the prince but not his polity. A universalistic ethics is alien to him. Therefore, he can defend munificence as long as it is at the expense of conquered nations. Furthermore, Machiavelli does not claim that the person who engages in tough behavior is always motivated by the right motive. The prince may well be driven only by his own desire for power, to which, in fact, Machiavelli himself appeals in broaching his novel topic to the addressee of his treatise. But Machiavelli will have regarded himself as morally justified in appealing to the will to power of a prince if, by doing so, he was to bring about positive consequences, such as the liberation of Italy from foreign rule, for which he pleads at the end of his book. I hope the foregoing reflections make it clear why Machiavelli is important in the history of not only political theory, but also that of ethics proper. Perhaps you could say that since Machiavelli, ethicists have become aware of the scary possibility that the canon of virtues of both the ancient and the Christian traditions is not necessarily consistent. This is the rational core of Isaiah Berlin's famous essay, The Originality of Machiavelli. Even if we cherish the intrinsic value of all these virtues, we have to reckon with the possibility that they may have negative consequences that contradict the purposes that other virtues, and perhaps even these virtues themselves, want to reach. We thus face the dilemma that intrinsically attractive behavior may be deleterious, while repulsive behavior, even behavior motivated by abhorrent motives, may be socially far more useful. It would be worthwhile to show how this new insight soon pervades also the greatest literature of the time, even that of an author like Shakespeare, who shares in the demonization of Machiavelli peculiar to the Elizabethan age. His king Henry VI is a pious and profoundly good person, but as king he is a disaster. His weakness causes a civil war for which he has the moral dignity to feel responsible. His father Henry V, on the other hand, is a morally complex character, but the toughness with which he hangs his old fellow Bardolph, who has pillaged a French church, maintains discipline in the troop, and would have been hailed by Machiavelli as truly virtuous. Similarly, Cervantes' Don Quixote is driven by noble motives, yet at least at the beginning of his story, the real consequences of his actions are very harmful, as poor Andres has to experience in the 4th chapter of the 1st volume. But in the process of writing his novel, Cervantes altered his original purpose, for at the end of the first part, Don Quixote proves to be an extraordinarily beneficial person. Still, it is only a strange series of seemingly fortuitous, perhaps providential events that makes the Hidalgo able to be more than a good person, namely to cause good consequences in the world. Real life is something else, and therefore the 17th and 18th centuries defend a new ethics quite different from that of medieval monks and knights. People understood quickly that the changes in the value system brought about by capitalism were in tension with traditional Christian virtues. Symptomatic of this understanding are reflections in the first years of the 18th century by Pierre Bayle, as well as the following remark in Jonathan Swift's masterful satire, an argument to prove that the abolishing of Christianity in England may, as things now stand, be attended with some inconveniences and perhaps not produce those many good effects proposed thereby, of 1708. This work limits itself to the defense of nominal Christianity, since real Christianity, he writes, is incompatible with the spirit of the new time. To offer at the restoring of that real Christianity would indeed be a wild project, It would be to break the entire frame and constitution of things, to ruin trade, extinguish arts and sciences with the professors of them. In short, to turn our courts, exchanges, and shops into deserts. Swift continues a tradition of Christian criticism of modernity, which achieved a certain peak in the Jansenist movement. And, in fact, Mandeville, the most radical defender of capitalism in the early 18th century, draws upon Jansenist sensibilities when he develops his own anthropology and ethics. Therefore, some of his earlier interpreters, particularly Hector Monroe, have taken his profession of moral rigorism seriously, even if a careful reading makes it very likely that his pious remarks, for example at the end of an inquiry into the origin of mutual virtue, are only the screen for a more cynical attitude. But there are scholars who think that Mandeville is serious in his criticism of capitalism. I don't think so, but the position has been defended by intelligent people. But it is the cynicism of a man certainly frustrated by mankind. Apparently, Mandeville lowers man to the level of animals because he's outraged at human cruelty towards animals. While the Jansenists declared it a moral duty to return to the austerity of the original Christians, Mandeville only gestures at this position in order to have more freedom to outline his own dark vision of man. When he writes that nothing renders a person more glorious than voluntary poverty, cheerfully accepted, one feels that there are some relics of sincere fascination for such a behavior. But Mandeville, first, does not think that it occurs very often even among Christian clergy. And second, he has a suspicion that it may be more motivated by obstinate vanity than by greatness of soul. Like the Jansenists, Mandeville sees modern society driven by egoistic drives. However, and this is the fundamental difference, he is willing to pay this moral price, one he regards as necessary for economic success. We must unleash egoism if we want to bring humanity out of terrible poverty. What he does not tolerate is a moral hypocrisy that wants to have a cake and eat it too, enjoy economic progress and pretend that it is still inspired by Christian values. Mandeville remains indebted to the Jansenists because he rejects the alternative view defended by Anthony Cooper, 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury, that our nature is constituted by both selfish and altruistic affections that somehow harmonize with each other. This position is classically formulated in the Augustan age by Alexander Pope in the last 2 verses of the 3rd epistle in his essay on man. Thus God and nature linked the general frame and bade self-love and social be the same. In fact, the second part of Mandeville's book consists of 6 dialogues, the main interlocutors of which, Horatio and Cleomenes, are inspired by Shaftesbury and Mandeville respectively. It ends with a refutation of Shaftesbury, who labored hard to unite two contraries that can never be reconciled together, innocence of manner and worldly greatness. According to Mandeville, humans are driven by passions, but while even Hume would agree with his viewpoint, Mandeville goes on to insist that these passions are basically selfish, the rest merely deception, in the best of cases, self-deception. But we can still be happy in such a world, for the unleashing of human greed must favor economic and social progress. Mandeville's most famous work is built around 200 doggerel couplets published in 1705 under the title The Grumbling Hive, or Knaves Turned Honest. In 1714, the text was reissued together with 20 lengthy remarks in prose and an inquiry into the origin of moral virtue under the comprehensive title The Fable of the Bees, or Private Vices, Public Benefits. The work continued to be expanded until in 1729 it received a second volume containing the dialogues aforementioned. From 1724 onward, it was attacked by theologians and ethicists and was even presented as a public nuisance by the grand jury of Middlesex. In France, it was ordered to be burned by the hangman. In 1732, an anonymous poet wrote about man-devil. And if God-man vice to abolish came, who wise commands, man-devil be his name. Indeed, this man-devil, like Machiavelli, commends what the tradition had rejected as vice. Again, not simply because this is in the interest of the individual, but on the contrary, because these private vices generate public benefits. The beasts prosper because they're vicious. I'm quoting, thus every part was full of vice, yet the whole mass a paradise. The poem shows that the worst possible would occur if the knaves turned honest and reduced their needs to the level ascribed to the Golden Age. In such a case, the prices of land and houses would immediately fall and economic activities would slow, for content is the bane of industry. Such a new hive would not be able to withstand repeated attacks by stronger enemies, and thus it would have to withdraw from the world. They flew into a hollow tree, blessed with content and honesty. If anyone wants to avoid this result, he is well advised to accept the vices of luxury and pride, and even of fraud, since that creates jobs for lawyers. Nothing less can thrive than lawyers in an honest hive. Therefore, the moral that the end teaches, fraud, luxury, and pride must live, while we the benefits receive. In the remarks, Mandeville gives some very weak examples. Without drunkenness, wine merchants would have fewer profits. Without burglars, smiths would suffer heavy losses. Prodigal heirs do a service to the economy by creating jobs, and poverty is needed to motivate people to work. Whoever defends frugality shows himself a better man than he is a politician. Mandeville rejects the idea that only luxury goods are morally problematic, since according to him, all goods or none are luxury goods. According to him, people may go to church together and be all of one mind as much as they please. I'm apt to believe that when they pray for their daily bread, the bishop includes several things in that petition which the sexton does not think on. As Machiavelli dislikes the inconsistency of praising military discipline but rejecting the severity that ensures it, Mandeville exhorts his reader to choose between a good and honest and a great and wealthy society. Whoever wants to render his subjects rich must know that he cannot have them virtuous. This does not mean that a wise politician should simply allow all passions to unfold. His task consists in regulating them in such a way that they are turned to a good end. Whoever would civilize man and establish them into a body politic must be thoroughly acquainted with all the passions and appetites, strengths and weaknesses of a frame, and understand how to turn their greatest frailties to the advantage of the public. Mandeville does not deny that the vices have to be directed in order to become beneficial. So vice is beneficial found when it's by justice loped and bound. As is well known, Mandeville has several economic insights that contributed to the collapse of mercantilism. He understands, for example, that the fruits of the earth and the labor of the people are a more certain, a more inexhaustible, and a more real treasure than the gold of Brazil. That the hoarding of money within a country will not help it, and that strengthening exports without allowing for corresponding imports cannot work. These are all important insights in the early 18th century, and they become standard insights in the later economy developed by people like Adam Smith. In general, the thrust of his economic philosophy is to increase economic freedom, which will regulate itself. Even if Adam Smith disliked him, Mandeville anticipates his belief in the invisible hand and is relieved that the economy does not have to appeal to virtues in order to work. For unhappy is the people, and their constitution will be ever precarious, whose welfare must depend upon the virtues and consciences of ministers and politicians. Nevertheless, Mandeville is completely aware of the fact that trade can only function if there is an administration of justice, wisely contrived and strictly executed. He recognizes that when offices of the greatest trust are bought and sold, the ministers that should serve the public, both great and small, corrupted, and the country is every moment in danger of being betrayed to the highest bidders, such a situation cannot work. These are indeed terrible things. But he says it's politics, not economy, that represents the real danger. Of course, this account leaves the question open of when justice in politics comes from. How is it possible that some people restrain from the satisfaction of their immediate interest and do not betray their duty to the highest bidder, provided they do not run a serious risk of being punished. Mandeville tries to give a genealogical account of the evolution of our moral ideas, anticipating many of the ideas of Vico and Nietzsche. At the beginning, he teaches, there was a division between two classes of people, one surrendering to all of the passions, the other aiming at self-control and thus empowering itself to rule over the first. The experience that other person's immediate satisfaction of their drives could be quite a nuisance to oneself led to giving the name of virtue to every performance by which man, contrary to the impulse of nature, should endeavor the benefit of others or the conquest of his own passions out of a rational ambition of being good. In order to stabilize this disposition, society brought forth a system of honors and flattered those who managed to develop virtue. Moral virtues are the political offspring which flattery begot upon pride. Pride is socially useful, for it is what motivates selfish misers to leave their estates to charitable institutions. But if Mandeville takes enormous pride in examining himself as one ought and unmasking one's pretended virtues, does he not contribute to the collapse of this result of social evolution? When he calls honor a chimera without truth or being, an invention of moralists and politicians, does he not invite people to get rid of it? He himself mentions with a certain melancholy sympathy Don Quixote, who still felt more obliged than entitled by his concept of honor. But of those who now understand honor as nothing more than the refusal to suffer any affront, it has any legitimate criticism, not closer to Mandeville's wisdom than the Hidalgo. I mentioned at the beginning that the same type of argument that we find in Machiavelli and Mandeville can be also found in Malthus. There is one important difference, however, between the earlier and later thinkers. Malthus was an Anglican minister. In the first edition of an essay on the principle of population of 1798, does not explicitly favor any change in the traditional canon of virtues, as Machiavelli and Mandeville do. His point is merely descriptive. But like them, he describes an alternative between virtuous behavior that leads to misery and vicious behavior that avoids it. His main idea is well known, is directed against the optimistic philosophy of history endorsed by Nicolas de Carità, Marquis de Condorcet, and William Godwin, who in view of the enormous scientific progress of the 17th and 18th century and the French Revolution respectively, saw humankind in the grip of an irresistible progress. Malthus, on the other hand, insists that all of the increase in economic productivity will be counteracted by demographic growth, which occurs in geometric proportion, while increase in food production can, as he erroneously assumed, happen only in arithmetic progression. But I'm not interested here in the details of his argument, which can be disconnected from his last assumption. According to Malthus, there are two checks to population growth, a preventive one and a positive one. The first consists in limiting the number of births, for example, by renouncing or delaying marriage. Malthus insists that this is inevitably connected to vice, by which he must mean extramarital sexual activities, including prostitution, and a limitation of births by various means. The effects, indeed, of these restraints upon marriage are but too conspicuous in the consequent vices that are produced in almost every part of the world, vices that are continually involving both sexes in inextricable unhappiness. These vices could only be avoided by early marriages and the willingness to have as many children as can be born. Yet, the consequences of this behavior are deleterious, for inevitably the positive check will operate. I believe it has been very generally remarked by those who have attended to bills of mortality that of the number of children who die annually, much too great a proportion belongs to those who may be supposed unable to give their offspring proper food and attention. Malthus, I repeat, does not at all explicitly endorse what he calls vice, as later Malthusians will do. But in 1798, he thinks that humanity will inevitably oscillate between the poles of misery and vice. Only in the second edition of 1803 does he introduce a third check, what he calls moral restraint, which seems to be his solution to a dilemma described, postponement of marriage and reduced sexual activities within the family. However, Malthus challenges traditional Christian teaching as early as 1798 regarding one issue. As Mandeville had done in his scathing criticism of Christian charity in an essay on charity and charity schools, Malthus, who would soon become professor of history and political economy, criticizes Pitt's poor laws. He recognizes that they were undoubtedly instituted for the most benevolent purpose, but there is great reason to think that they have not succeeded in their intention. Malthus is not only afraid that they destroy any sense of independence and responsibility, he also fears that they only increase the problem they are supposed to heal by encouraging the poor to reproduce. It possesses in a high degree the great and radical defect of all systems of the kind, that of tending to increase population without increasing the means for its support, and thus to depress the condition of those that are not supported by parishes, and consequently to create more poor. Machiavelli, Mondeville, and Malthus have contributed to the decline of our moral respect for certain traditional virtues, and thus of behavior inspired by them, by pointing out the negative consequences that can attend clemency in the political realm, temperance and charity in the sphere of economy, and the desire to have a large family on the demographic level. By obliging us to look at the negative consequences of virtues, the intrinsic positive values of which we do not really deny, they have rendered our moral evaluation more complex and difficult. For we now have to weigh the intrinsic and the extrinsic values of certain attitudes against each other, and there is no algorithm for doing so. At the same time, they would not have been so successful if they had not offered an enormous relief to the shapers of modernity. By pointing likewise to the positive consequences of behavior of which the tradition disapproved, they have decreased the moral pressure on humankind, for they suggest that these vices may well be allowed to flourish, since they will prove beneficial in the end. This is of particular relevance in the case of the economic realm. We may disapprove of greed, but if there are good reasons to believe that under certain conditions unleashing it may prove more effective in overcoming poverty than any realistic alternative, we should not worry too much about it. Fundamentally, it's an idea that found its expression, I think, 45 years ago in your country, when Deng Xiaoping said, "I don't care whether the cat is white or black as long as it catches a mice. I don't care whether we introduce elements of capitalist economy as long as this leads people out of absolute poverty." It's fundamentally this idea. This is of if we accept the pessimistic Augustinian view of human nature, a view appropriated and deepened by both Protestantism and Jansenism, there is indeed relief in the insight that the economy is partly a self-regulatory system, and that therefore appeal to goodness is not necessary. Adam Smith famously wrote, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest." The doctrine of the invisible hand, which Smith also shares with his forerunner, also renders it less necessary to believe in the integrity and wisdom of politicians, which mercantilism had to presuppose. Some theorists could even think that the transformation of private vices into public benefits is a sign of divine providence. And while Mondeville hardly means this statement seriously, his contemporary Vico clearly does. Still, Mondeville's pessimistic view was soon rejected by mainstream economics. I've already mentioned that Shaftesbury defends a very different anthropology according to which humans have both selfish and sociable instincts. This theory is further developed in varying forms by both David Hume and his friend Adam Smith, who was a professor of moral philosophy and first wrote the theory of moral sentiments before he authored The Wealth of Nations. I shall look shortly at the criticism of Mondeville. In his essay of a refinement in the arts, originally called Of Luxury, of 1752, David Hume addresses in a classic way the question that vexed many of the theorists of the 18th century, namely whether the increasing wealth of modern societies is in itself good or bad. He begins by recognizing, similarly to Mondeville, that luxury is a word of uncertain signification. He then proceeds by declaring that the gratification of a sense is not of itself a vice. Furthermore, it has positive consequences. The desire for refined pleasures helps people to overcome indolence, which is never an agreeable state. Progress in the mechanical arts stimulates the liberal arts. Men become more sociable. Brutal excesses are mitigated by refined pleasures. states become stronger, economic progress favors the formation of a middle class and thus political liberty. However, Hume recognizes that the gratification of a sense can become a vice if it occurs at the expense of some other virtue, such as liberality or charity. Hume adamantly rejects the position that only the vicious can achieve the good economic results that both he and Mandeville favor. Certainly, the desire for luxury may motivate people to work more, and their demand may then create jobs for the poor. But if a person liberates himself from this desire and still works the same amount, he may well spend his money in the education of his children, in the support of his friends, and in relieving the poor. That labor, which at present is employed only in producing a slender gratification to one man, would relieve the necessitous and bestow satisfaction on hundreds. A world in which all these positive consequences could be achieved without any vice, according to Hume, is logically possible. Yet Hume agrees that given other human vices, such as sloth, the removal of the desire for luxury goods may have negative consequences. He insists on a holistic approach. You must only take care to remove all the vices. If you remove part, you may render the matter worse. Let us therefore rest contented with asserting that two opposite vices in a state may be more advantageous than either of them alone. But let us never pronounce vice in itself advantageous. Hume then attacks an author, not mentioned by name, even if the footnote refers to the fables of the beast, for claiming that moral distinctions are only inventions of politicians, while at the same time averring that vice is advantageous to the public. For something of this nature could hardly be a vice. Mandeville might object to Hume that something whose unintended consequence is good may well be bad, but Hume might retort that a politician who, after reading Mandeville, Hume, or Smith, understands and promotes these consequences can no longer regard them as unintended. Mandeville might then answer that this does not yet prove that the politician's motive is to achieve these good consequences. In practice, however, Hume and Mandeville are not that far from each other, for Hume agrees that a humanity without vices is not a political possibility. Still, he insists on the philosophical relevance of his criticism. 7 years after Hume, Smith addresses Mandeville in the last part of his theory of the sentiments, of moral sentiments, and points to two main weaknesses of the theory. He shows that self-love may frequently be a virtuous motive of action, and that in any case the desire to render oneself a proper object of honor cannot be called vanity. He furthermore rejects Mandeville's premise that any indulgence in any passion is vicious. Smith recognizes that out of this rigoristic position of Mandeville arose a system which, though perhaps it never gave occasion to more vices than what would have been without it, at least taught that vice which arose from other causes to appear with more effrontery and to show the corruption of its motives with a profligate audaciousness which had never been heard of before. Smith is right that Mandeville's justification gave a human desire for profit, which the earlier tradition had regarded with suspicion, if not contempt, the possibility of expressing itself with an effrontery unheard before. Mandeville's cynicism, however, still rests on a rigorous ethics of Jansenist provenience. Even if he sees selfishness at the bottom of things, he thinks it is in dire need of justification via its consequences. A much greater effrontery can be expected after such a background has evaporated and the search for virtue has been replaced by an increasingly individualistic concept of rights. Then the argument that the market is the best tool for achieving certain objectively good ends, such as a rational allocation of scarce commodities, yields to the idea that independent of the results, the free choice of economic activities is the ultimate end to which everything else must be subservient. Any ethical analysis of capitalism that does not recognize that the system uses, in a way unknown before, mechanisms not intended by but still inherent in human actions is hopelessly naive. The moralist protest that is unfamiliar with these mechanisms rightly meets with scorn from the side of economists whose main purpose is to study them, a study that has become increasingly more demanding due to a mathematization that only partly mirrors the mathematical operations of economic actors. In part, it describes processes that occur as do processes in nature without their agents being aware of a mathematical logic that determines them. Still, economic theory does not simply mirror economic reality. It impacts it, since intelligent economic actors try to learn from it. This is one of the reasons why several successful economic policies cannot be used over the same amount of time as engineering procedures, but are rather far more short-lived. The economic agents may react against them and thus render them obsolete, since they describe a reality with agents not yet aware of them. The crisis of Keynesianism in the 1970s and 80s in Western Europe had to do with the fact that after some decades, people developed rational, not simply adaptive expectations and anticipated in their demands for higher wages the inflation that was part of the Keynesian solution to a problem of unemployment. This, however, led to both unemployment and inflation. Let me explain this point because this is a very important issue. The traditional solution that Keynes found to a problem of unemployment is the state has to get indebted in order to develop public works, and then the state will pay back its debt by accepting inflation. And it really helped to stabilize the capitalist economy after the great economic crisis of 29. Many people have said Keynes saved capitalism. However, people are not stupid. People understood how Keynesianism worked. And therefore, in the 1970s, the labor unions said, yes, you want later to have an inflation in order to pay back the public debt. Therefore, you must give us higher wages. And then the result was that you had an inflation, but since the wages were too high, you had also unemployment. And that was the famous stagflation of the 1970s. And that led to the liberal revolt of the Chicago boys in the 1980s. These were not bad people. They understood that Keynesianism did not work, not because Keynes was stupid, but because people had understood how Keynesianism worked. And therefore, they had to change the economic policy. I do not think that all the changes that happened in the 1980s were good. I'm not a friend of the Chicago boys, but I do think that they had seen a serious problem, and they had given the correct theoretical analysis of why Keynesianism did not work anymore. This is what we have to have in mind. On the other hand, an intelligent moral criticism of economic behavior remains possible and necessary, even if in the course of the 19th century, the social sciences, including economics, detached themselves from ethics and became value-free. Every human action remains subject to a moral judgment. Clearly, the development and deliberate fostering of the triad of modern science, technology, and capitalism, with its incentives on investment, has led to a historically unparalleled economic growth and to absolute wealth for a huge number of people, without necessarily diminishing relative poverty, which, however, is a far lesser moral problem. I mean, the difference between absolute and relative poverty is you can have a system where the absolute poverty disappears. All people have enough to eat and to be housed, etc. But the relative poverty increases because relative poverty is defined, you can define it in a different way, but less than 50% of immediate income, sometimes less than 60% of immediate income. And of course, it is possible that everyone gets richer, but the polarization increases. So we have a decrease of absolute poverty and an increase of relative poverty. Not only this is logically possible, but that's usually the way how the unleashing of capitalism starts. It's almost inevitable at least at the beginning. Furthermore, capitalism is not simply an economic system based on private property, market mechanisms, and the universalized desire to maximize profits by intelligent investments. Capitalism is expression of a certain mindset. It not only creates wealth, it has changed the value system of society as profoundly as few other events in history. I think someone who understood this very well and expressed it in a fantastic way are Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the Communist Manifesto. Some of these changes are morally noble. Capitalism is based on a new appreciation of work and discipline and on the idea that people have to deserve their wealth by earning it. It takes the human desire for freedom and for upward mobility seriously, but at the same time ties these desires to the necessity of work. In an ideal capitalist system, one in which the roles of luck and inheritance would be dramatically reduced, a person could become rich only by satisfying other persons' needs. Even though this new mobility may well lead to enormous disparities, the system is certainly more egalitarian than earlier social forms like feudalism, and gives the consumer incomparably more power than does any planned economy, even one that is democratically legitimized. For in a market economy, the consumer can contribute by her purchase, which is the equivalent of a vote, to determining what will be produced. By creating a global economy, capitalism furthermore creates an interdependence that makes going to war less rational than it was before. This is not sufficient to prevent wars, but I do think that the argument of already 18th century, you find it in Montesquieu, in Adam Smith, and in Kant, that global interdependence will decrease wars is not implausible. But there are still three decisive moral limits of capitalism that we have not been able to resolve. First, let us assume that there would indeed exist an absolute convergence of self-interest and public welfare. A decisive distinction in ethics is that between what is objectively right, a state of affairs that is desirable for moral reasons, and what is subjectively moral, the intention that aims at the state of affairs for the reason that it is objectively right. It is doubtless true that a subjectively moral intention must aim at what seems objectively right. But it may not aim at what is objectively right, owing to ignorance, without forfeiting the claim to be subjectively moral. And certainly the inverse also holds. Objectively right results may be brought about by persons who are not subjectively moral, but is not committed to a perspective that transcends their self-interest. The difference between the objectively right and the subjectively moral is thus ineludible. Now, the idea that lies at the basis of capitalism makes it more difficult to find out whether an action is subjectively moral, for its enormous success rests exactly in creating a system in which the pursuit of one's own interests leads to public benefits. Therefore, successful economic activities may be motivated as well by greed as by a sincere concern for the welfare of others. Since it's not moral to subject one's fellow human beings to groundless suspicions, and since without further information both accounts are plausible, it is not permissible to say that the person who achieves economic success must be motivated only by selfish regards. Even less it is acceptable to criticize the political actors that allow the unfolding of capitalism if they have good reasons to believe that this is the most efficient way of achieving universal wealth. Still, it is important that our curiosity regarding our ultimate motives be satisfied, and thus it is a blessing in disguise that this harmony exists only partially. For even if a market leads to an equilibrium between supply and demand, it satisfies only the needs of those that have purchasing power, and there are quite a few persons without it, not all of whom are responsible for a situation through their own decisions. While it is a reasonable moral decision not to encourage sloth, starving children cannot be reproached for their condition. And even adults who did not have access to an education that would have enabled them to acquire the capacities necessary in order to flourish in a complex market society are hardly responsible for it. Intelligent charitable activities are always possible, and they are important not only because they address problems that the market cannot solve, but also because they uphold a behavior which is more likely to be an expression of the subjectively moral. Even if Mondeville is right that some of this behavior may be motivated by vanity, it is a sophism to regard all human behavior as selfish only because it inevitably must be motivated by something within the subject herself. There are differences between our motives, and the willingness to achieve something good, even if one does not profit from it, is not the same thing as aiming solely at one's own interest. Those successful entrepreneurs who invest their profits in non-profit foundations dedicated to moral ends deserve certainly more moral respect than those who do not. Second, let us move from the level of the subjectively moral to that of the objectively right. The person who becomes rich in a legal way in a market economy has the merit of having satisfied the needs of person with purchasing power. This is, whatever its motive, something prima facie objectively good. I add prima facie because the concrete value of his acts depends strongly on the nature of the needs satisfied and perhaps created by the supplier. Certain needs are essential to our survival or flourishing as moral and intellectual beings. But there are other needs whose satisfaction does not make us better or happier beings, and there are even needs whose fulfillment harms either us or other people. The success of modern economic theory consists in its capacity to develop a general concept of factual preference ordering that is able to explain prices. And no doubt, this procedure is legitimate. Nevertheless, reducing values to the factual prices is unacceptable, tempting as it is on the basis of a radical empiricism, since prices are empirical facts, while the ontological status of values is more dubious. Still, knowing the value of nothing and the price of everything is the mark of vulgarity. There are good moral reasons to value various needs differently, and thus also the economic activities that satisfy them. No doubt a moral entrepreneur must survive on the market, and thus he must address needs that exist or can easily be elicited. But his moral dignity depends on him being able to find an intersection between what he regards as moral needs and what are merely factual needs. But not only are not all needs respectable, satisfy them may directly harm the buyer, even if he craves their satisfaction. Heroin addiction would be an obvious example, but there is a far larger gray zone. Think of tobacco addiction. Even if one does not agree that harming oneself is morally permissible, there is little doubt that harming others is worse. But many economic activities rely on externalizing costs, that is, passing on damages to others. The ecological crisis is one of the results of such externalizing. We pass damages on to those who cannot defend themselves against these damages, either persons in less developed countries or future generations. Future generations are particularly weak because they lack both purchasing power and suffrage. Thus, they play hardly any role in the two main institutions of modernity, the market and democracy. Clearly, it is one of the main tasks of a just legal and economic policy to develop a set of rules that renders the externalization of costs more difficult, partly by redefining the contribution of nature to national wealth and raising according the prices for natural resources, partly by extending liability, and partly by empowering future generations. It can hardly be expected from a moral entrepreneur that he renounces the externalization of costs when this would lead to his failure on the market, due to the fact that his competitors would not join him. But he certainly may be expected to give up activities that would only increase his profits without being necessary for his survival. Particularly, he should lobby for and not against those legal reforms that would render the externalization of costs more difficult. But not only may capitalism sometimes be an expression of motives that are not subjectively moral, not only may it accelerate processes that are objectively wrong, such as the externalization of costs, the mindset of capitalism, utterly unleashed, may develop a tendency of being self-destructive. Why? Capitalism's healthy mistrust against persons who want to benefit from the work of others without working themselves can lead to a general skepticism against charities and to the ideology that maximizing one's own profit is the main purpose and the sole duty of life. If this mindset spreads, capitalism is itself endangered. As even Mondeville understands, capitalism can only unfold if the administration of justice is not for sale to the highest bidder. Something analogous holds also for the activities of the central bank and the economic policies of the government in general. For every incentive to work will disappear if a poor person in litigation must fear that the judge will assign the produce of his work to the richer party. If the owner of a savings account has reason to believe that the central bank will accept an inflation that will deprive him of his modest savings while helping speculants, or if the dynamic entrepreneur with a superior product will be ignored by the minister who has been bribed by a less efficient competitor. Capitalism presupposes far more trust than pre-capitalist systems. After all, it lives from people entrusting their savings not to their stockings but to banks. And the evaporation of social trust must, in the long run, corrode capitalist capacity to function. Of course, most countries have laws against corruption. But if the judges who have to apply these laws are themselves corrupt, or if a government succeeds in limiting the applicability of these laws, corruption will almost inevitably spread. Needless to say, this will poison not only the political but also the economic process. Still, this process may take one or more generations, and from the point of view of pure rational egoism, For some agents, particularly if they're elderly, it may well be recommendable to pursue such a strategy. There is no guaranteed harmony between rational interest and moral duty. Probably the persons who engage in corruption will calm their consciences by saying that they do nothing more than extend the basic principle of economic rationality to the political realm. While the number of countries in which such shameless corruption reigns is not too big, a less direct way of changing the laws is almost ubiquitous. Lobbying in parliaments. America suffers from the lobbying activities like of cancer to a nation. No doubt in a democracy, economic actors must be able to propose reasonable changes to the legislators. But the changes proposed are not always in the public interest, and the strength of character necessary to reject them may well become rarer in a society that values profits more than anything else. If, furthermore, the opinion has become dominant that there are no objective criteria for just economic policies, one should not be too surprised if politicians engage in activities that are likely to enhance their own interest, be it directly economic or connected to their desire of maintaining and perhaps expanding their political power. Daniel Bell has spoken of the cultural contradictions of capitalism, mainly having in mind the contrast between the drive for optimization and economization on the one hand and the modernist revolt that longs for pre-modern forms of expression on the other. But the conflict between the unleashing of a desire for profit in order to promote growth and the necessity of maintaining a political class that understands itself as the guardian of the market independently of its own economic interest is even more dangerous. Probably the value system of early modern elites, inspired as it was by self-respect, desire for honor, and admiration for virtuous behavior, a religious awareness, was necessary to bring forth a functioning capitalism. That is Max Weber's famous thesis. And it's not clear to me whether capitalism can keep going if these moral presuppositions are relinquished. If Mandeville, the moral philosopher, triumphs, Mandeville, the economist's defense of capitalism, will collapse. Thank you for your attention.